I am excited to introduce my panel, which will address the tensions between controlling advertisement and keeping the internet free. I'm privileged to be joined today by Marina, Sonia, and Stephen, all experts in the area of privacy, advertising, and internet policy. So in brief, Marina Pavlovic is co-director of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society and an associate professor within the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on consumer rights in the contemporary cross-border digital society and technology policy and regulation. Sonia Carreno is the president of IAB Canada, the recognized voice and thought leader of the Canadian interactive marketing and advertising industry. Among her many accomplishments, she has been developing standards for the Canadian market in response to GDPR regulations in the UK and has presented to the Canadian House of Commons about privacy regulations. Stephen Bonner is the Deputy Information Commissioner at the ICO, the UK's independent body set up to uphold information rights. His current role includes leading the teams reviewing the technology ecosystem around ad tech and the teams auditing and enforcing in this space. So to briefly introduce our topic, I think advertising and privacy on the internet is such an interesting space, particularly as consumers and users become more aware of advertising online. And in particular, how their personal information is central to some types of advertising. And there can be a lot more going on in the background that users aren't even aware of. So in the panels this morning, we heard a lot about the importance of transparency, particularly ensuring consumers understand what's happening with their data, coupled with the responsibility of the organization to describe their practice accurately. And this is in an effort to help consumers adjust their expectations. As we know, expectations are important. In the privacy world, we talk a lot about not being creepy, as in not doing things that are surprising or unexpected that will creep out your users. But advertising can be full of creepy things. I am sure many of you remember being a little or a lot creeped out when you found your Google search following you around the internet in the form of ads popping up on unrelated web pages when you least expected it. But what is creepy does depend on public opinion, the specific expectations and understanding of the user, and the outcomes. And I'm sure this is something we've all experienced. So by way of personal example, a few years ago, one of my favorite retailers was having their semi-annual sale, but I was on vacation, and in the excitement of traveling and time zone differences, I missed the sale and was super disappointed because I had a cart full of items. A few days later, I got an email from that retailer saying, "Hey, Amanda, we noticed you missed our recent sale. Since you always buy things from us during the sale, we'd like to offer you a discount code." Of course, I was thrilled. I also realized this meant my purchasing behavior was being closely tracked, and I don't recall being clearly made aware of that practice. But quite honestly, since it resulted in something I did want, in that moment, I was more than happy for the retailer to be tracking my purchasing patterns. But there's so much more to advertising than just not being creepy. And so I've asked each of our panelists to speak about a tension that's on their mind, and we're happy to take questions from participants. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll turn now to Marina to kick off our discussion.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you to Dentons and ICJ for hosting this. I'm delighted to be here and sharing this panel with Stephen and Sonia, because I think we all approach this issue from very different perspectives. So I think it's not just about not being creepy. I think the challenge with advertising that it has shaped or is shaping the internet as we know it. And I think at this point, we may be at the point where it's almost breaking the internet. And so I think while advertising helped build the internet the way it is, I think we're at a point that we understand that the ad-driven internet is not necessarily sustainable, but it may not necessarily be as harmless as we used to think. So yes, we all like to get discounts for our favorite goods, but I think at this point, advertising is actually much more. It's much more than just the commercial aspect that we all tend to think about when we think about this. So there are considerable privacy concerns. I think there are considerable commercial concerns. There are competition concerns. There are functional concerns in terms of whether the internet can operate without advertising. And I think there are considerable concerns both for individual users, which is all of us, and the network operators, like service providers who actually run the networks. And from my perspective, I think most importantly, for the functioning not just of the free and open internet, but for the functioning of the free and open democratic society. And I'll touch upon political advertising in a second, because I think we have moved from an area where advertising was, again, just for purely commercial purposes, where we're pushing products, to entering a number of different areas that we haven't had it before, or if it existed, it was under a very strict and controlled environment. And so that the results that we're seeing are very, very different. So I think Stephen and Sonia will touch much more on privacy and commercial concerns and related tensions. And I thought within this introduction, perhaps to highlight some tensions that are not necessarily keeping me at night, but are of a growing concern. And so I think we're past the stage where we were kind of initially ignorant and then maybe tacitly accepting the fact that certain internet services, mainly social media, but not just them, a bunch of others, come nominally free, but are actually paid by users with their data, which is then used for targeted advertising. Like, I think we're past the stage where this type of social bargaining was acceptable. Because we're seeing that, first of all, the data that's being collected is much more robust and can be manipulated in ways that couldn't be manipulated before. That the sophistication of AI and algorithms is just growing, and what's being collected and what's being done with data is very, very different than what we knew before. And I think we're past the stage where advertising is just seen as an annoyance, right? Where certain products are being pushed at you. So if you browsed at your, again, favorite retailer, then for the next a month, whichever website you go to, there's going to be, oh, this particular shoe, is going to be on sale, right? So so that it's actually like we're in a different era, I think, and we need different tools to approach this. I'm hesitant to say to regulate, because there are different forms of regulation. And I think, as the Privacy Commissioner mentioned, there's a considerable intersection of both issues and playing fields. And then, like, if you pull one strand, you kind of have to pull all the other strands. And I don't think we have reached the consensus where we can kind of approach issues holistically. We're still regulating things in their own silos, and there are lots of unintended consequences for some of that. So I think on the somewhat positive side, advertising does provide a revenue stream for unlikely players, such as individual users, in the influencer category. And I don't mean Kardashians, but like, mom and pop stores or solo businesses, who either run their stores or have some sort of, a website where they provide content, and do provide, and do receive some considerable income from that advertising. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to allow a variety of different people to, monetize on some of the expert knowledge that they may have. But I think the extra revenue for these categories of people who are not necessarily the ones that we usually think of has implications for individual users and who are consumers of that content, right? That there are very few web pages now that you can visit that are on the surface ad-free, and most of them in the background at the back end are not ad-free as well, right? So, and I think one of the concerns that we don't necessarily talk about when we talk about these things is the ad traffic consumes a large portion of users' bandwidth. And I guess a corollary to that is a network traffic. And there are various numbers and various studies being done, that the ad traffic is from 20 to 50%. Like, I haven't found one that I was kind of happy with that would put it in a specific percentage. But let's say even if it's like at the 20% range, that's a huge amount of traffic, right? Like, that requires a lot of networking power on the provider side, and provides a lot of pressure for the network to ensure that the traffic is flowing. But it also provides a lot of pressure on individual users, and particularly in Canada, where we know that people in rural and remote communities are still struggling to have broadband access that's not limited, right? So that they have caps on how much they can use, and if 20% of that is invisible ad traffic, it is actually, there are considerable, I think, equity concerns in terms of that, you know, we all use internet now, not just to play, but to work and study, et cetera. So I think there's a growing number of users who are using ad blockers, and you know, those numbers have gone from like, I don't know, 20% to almost like 70%, depending on the category of people you're polling. In my household, we ran an experiment last week because I live with a techie, and I said, could we just sort of see, you know, how the traffic looks like when we run ad blockers, not on our individual browsers, but like at the network level. So we did put something on our server, on our actually router, to see, you know, what the traffic looks like in a week. And what I thought was absolutely fascinating is that 155,000 domains that were accessed from our network were on the ad list. So that there were like at least once there was a ping to a domain name, like, so the 155,000 domains, and I think like the rest of our traffic was like in sort of 50,000 domain category, not even, right? And that was like things happening knowingly or unknowingly in a week's time. So I don't have like the particular percentage of the traffic that it did, but like for me, the volume was just remarkable in terms of that, like anything, any web page that I used would have had not one, but like multiple ads. And I think what I found most fascinating is that certain websites were just like not functional at all. So if I was looking at a blog post, you know, to, I don't know, how to can green tomatoes, because it was a harvest season, right? That I couldn't see, like half of the page was blank because those were the ads that were moved. But what I found fascinating is when I went to Canadian Tire to check whether they had mason jars for my canned green tomatoes, that I could not actually access the Canadian Tire website. Like it was literally blocked and it wouldn't open. And so then when I switched from my home network to my cell network, where we didn't have, you know, the thingamajiggy that we had on our router, then I could totally access the Canadian Tire website and I could look for mason jars, et cetera, right? And so for me, the fact that, you know, the ads make the internet work the way it is, but like if you want to eliminate them, it literally breaks the internet and it does not work, is a huge concern. And I think part of the challenge is figuring out where are the areas and pockets that we could potentially write, like how do we fix this? And again, like I don't think it's possible to have an ad-free internet because we don't have ad-free media even in other mediums, right? So it, like, ads are necessary, they're what they are, but could we approach them from the perspective of, again, understanding how they function and like what are the areas where we could functionally eliminate them or minimize them? And then there are obviously issues of privacy, you know, transparency, et cetera, right? So for me, I think the issue is, it's not just keeping free and open internet, it's like, how do we make it better? Because I think where we are right now, that it's not necessarily at the breaking point, but it might be at the breaking point, right? And that we're looking at these bigger issues, and like some of the earlier panels talked about, and advertising usually, again, seems to be in that commercial category. It's somewhat harmless, you know, it's pushing the things that you might like, and if you don't like it, you kind of just ignore it. And I think that that's a problem, again, because it's not just like who we regulate, like what are jurisdictional parameters of that regulation. Can we actually jurisdictionally even regulate in the first place? Is it regulation versus self-regulation, as the Privacy Commissioner was talking about? Like, it is necessarily going to be some sort of public-private partnership in terms of regulation. But because it goes through so many horizontally areas of law, including privacy and competition and consumer protection, and, you know, transparency, et cetera, like how do we do it in a way that the users feel comfortable continuing to use the internet, you know, and if they don't want to see the ads and they have an ad blocker, that they can actually access the content that they want and they need. So I'm looking forward to Stephen and Sonia talking about some of their perspectives in terms of like, where do we go from here? I'm hopeful that it's fixable, but let's see if we can fix it one way or the other. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina. That was so interesting. And I loved hearing about your experiment that you did. And that's a huge volume of websites with ads. And it's so interesting to hear that some websites don't function when you turn the ads off. I know some of those like recipe websites where you have to scroll through a million ads before you can get like the 4-line recipe that you want are kind of annoying, but it's so interesting to sort of hear how the ad blocker really impacts that. So I'll turn to you now, Sonia, to let us know what tensions are on your mind.
Well, great. Thank you. Well, I feel like I now need to respond to about 7 points that Marina made representing the online advertising industry. I would like to first start by saying, yes, online advertising is absolutely necessary. It's not breaking the internet. I think the internet itself is in its very early iteration right now. We still have many, many innings of this game to play. And just having come off a couple of days of just a conference about blockchain and Web3, there's some really interesting developments happening in the next couple of years, and a lot of them are going to address some of the biggest tensions that we're faced with today. And so, I'm just I'll keep it brief in terms of what we're seeing as the tensions, so that we can have a little bit of discussion around it. But for us, there's the major trifecta now of the consumers actually starting to understand what advertising is doing online and how it functions. And so that is actually a welcomed thing for the online advertising industry. There's been books written about the fact that consumers were eventually going to take control of how they experience the internet anyways. Yeah, it took 20 years for that to happen, but here we are, and they're actually putting their foot down and threatening things like ad blocking. A note on ad blocking, this is a $10 billion industry in Canada, and when you think about the headlines that you're seeing today, and this week, I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of people that are losing their jobs directly as a result of advertising sales going down. So this is not just, oh no, I'm being followed around the internet for a pair of shoes. This is about people's livelihoods and employment and a big part of our economy. Can it be improved? Of course, but everything can be improved. So that's the first part, is the consumers. The second part is the fact that we're not unaware. So ad tech has had a head start on this. And as you could see by the demise of the third-party cookie, a lot of the creepiness that we're talking about is actually in the process of being eliminated as we speak, but we just can't wait for it. So we still talk about it, even though all of the headlines in the online advertising industry are all about the fact that that is going away by virtue of the fact that the technology is not going to be available to do it. Right. So I think that's a really important note. So before everybody sort of starts Googling, what's the best ad blocker, please don't do that. First of all, because there's, again, livelihoods at stake, and also because we're fixing it. And technology is actually making that happen. And then the third aspect is, of course, regulation. And so, and this has also been something that we've been getting ahead of since 2018, when even earlier than 2018, in 2017, the online advertising industry started taking note of the GDPR and started to build frameworks around transparency and consent that were more than placebo. Right. So more than just sort of saying, I don't like advertising, and now I've clicked a button and I've sort of made myself clear that I don't like advertising, but the advertising persists, that is going away. And now we're having meaningful consent mechanisms. In Canada, we're launching ours in the next coming week or so. And this is all about being able to get meaningful consent from a user and having that consent be signaled across the entire supply chain, so that everybody knows whether or not they can process data or not. So that's kind of my third point, and the fact that regulation can sometimes be a good thing. I think that it helps to accelerate some of the technology and some of the solutions that we're looking at. I do think that I would agree with Marina in the perspective that regulators are looking at things in isolation. and not necessarily from a holistic perspective. And one example of that we've seen in recent years is the regulation of marketing food and beverage to children in Canada, and some of the proposed remedies for that, and some of the proposed legislation that we've seen has been extremely challenging. And I'll just share why. If you want to eliminate high fat, high sodium, high sugar ads landing in front of a, let's say, 16-year-old, and you also, and that's over here, right? So that's Health Canada. And then over here, the OPC is wanting to preserve privacy. Can you tell me how I can avoid a 16-year-old getting exposed to a piece of pizza without breaking about 4 privacy laws? Right? So that to me is very real tension. And one that, again, I digress back to the Web3 and blockchain. We're solving for it. We're going to get to a place where there is going to be a world that has, surgically available data that does not disclose whole profile information or where you live or all of the details of your life, but rather just, are you affected by this legislation? If so, then no ad will be sent your way. And that's signaling. And that's something that is currently in the very, very early stages. And we see that with our consent transparency mechanism that's being launched in Canada in the coming weeks. And we've got some, information about that. So if anybody needs to read up on it, just go to our website. It's all free, and stay in touch on that. But recognize that this is a journey. It's an evolution. And the next iteration of blockchain infused web is going to address a lot of the things that are on everyone's wish list, and is going to create a balanced approach to privacy and allow the internet to thrive. And I do want to close my opening statement with also just saying, look, advertising is necessary. Advertising works. And if you look at some of the models that are out there, look at Netflix. Netflix has for years been built on the idea of subscription, and just recently said, you know what, we can't sustain this anymore. We can't sustain content without having an ad-supported model. And publishers depend on it. And if you want to talk about open and free and democratic access to information online, then advertising is the best opportunity to make that happen. And it provides livelihoods. It preserves Canadian national news and access to that news. And it's essential. It's essential to our culture, and it's essential to our country that we preserve some sort of a balance of privacy, and advertising does not get eliminated from the web. And ad blocking is a form of theft. Right, is our position. It's frankly, it's pirating content, right? Those journalists need to get paid. So that's but I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thank you, Sonia. Stephen, we've heard a lot about regulation, what regulators shouldn't do. We're excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Our fundamental view is the ways in which the current ad tech and online monitoring and tracking ecosystem function are broken. Now, I suspect I may have caused some immediate tension in the audience and perhaps other panelists, so let's drill down a little bit into that. For UK customers, the focus tends to be on the scene, the obvious visual elements such as improving the cookie prompts and pop-ups, which is supposed to give customers a level of choice in relation to what's put on their devices. And pretty much every customer I talk to has tension about these, the sort of get out my face reaction caused by inconvenient boxes popping up on every website they're trying to use in Europe and in the UK. Previous commissioner very memorably put this: it sucks the joy out of browsing the internet, which is not the intent of our privacy rules. And we're getting tense too. A number of these things we see don't have the right wording on them. If you want to cause tension for us, make those pop-ups completely incomprehensible, not compliant with data protection law, and written in a highly complex legalese. I'm sure many of the lawyers on the session today can understand, but normal people just cannot. We're working from the very largest sites downwards are changing some of this. For instance, we contributed to changes that occurred in the UK and Europe at Google, where in their consent flows for new users, they now have buttons for accept and reject at the same level at the top. Now, it's a small change, but it's quite an important one. That's better choice architecture, and it's becoming the new standard to have that decision about your cookies at the very top level. And there's no way around this. If you need consent, you need consent. You can't trick people into consenting to things. And I'd say even if you don't need it in your particular jurisdiction, you should want it. People should be encouraged and engaged to do this because you're offering them something valuable, or that they recognize the goal you're trying to achieve. We're already engaging about 30 other organizations to ask them make improvements in a similar way. But it's not enough to fiddle around at the edges. Many of the problems here are unseen. They're the hidden inner workings. Now, just to reassure Sonia, we absolutely love ads. The internet they funded is brilliant. As she highlighted, it was already in my notes here, so I can assure you we were already on board with this. They support a free press. They let small organizations generate revenue immediately that allows them to try new things and have innovation and growth that gives us some of the amazing things we use. But we're clear there are absolutely ways to reach customers without the illegal use of data. Things like contextual advertising are highly likely to meet our requirements in an easier way. We don't want privacy to just be for those who can pay for it. It should be a right for all. And we love that its change here is starting to be seen inevitable. Again, as Sonia highlighted, we get that everyone gets this needs to change. Now, we think it shouldn't just be tinkering at the edges. It needs to be substantial to become compliant. And its key benefit actually isn't only compliance with data protection laws in jurisdictions around the world, but it's to regain the trust of all players in the ecosystem. And that change needs to be global. And our work we've done so far around ad tech and data broking and real-time bidding has found some systemic issues. We've audited various companies, and we found evidence that many of the problems we identified in our pre-pandemic work on this topic still persist. The most common themes we see are insufficient transparency, poor consent practices, as I highlighted, weak security over the data as it's shared amongst third parties, and over retention of the data beyond the use it's needed to provide the service to the customer. Now, as well as those tensions, we also see that there is occasionally perceived a tension between competition law and privacy law, as some of your, I think was asked in the previous session. Ironically, we're not in competition with the competition authorities. We absolutely see that a vibrant and competitive environment actually allows users to make choices about who they use based on privacy if they care about that. It can be in a free and fair market without dominant players. That is more likely to occur. We published a joint statement with our UK competition authority, the CMA, last year, and laid the ways we're going to collaborate. One of those has been working with some of the big players about the post-cookie world to make sure they don't get an unfair advantage from the data that they have in their position. At our heart, we believe data protection laws are a how-to, not a don't-do. This isn't a piece of elastic being stretched to breaking point from both ends. We're not here to tell you can't sell things. We're here to say there are certain things you have to consider when doing so. And any teeth grinding from our tension you hear because we don't think it might not be happening fast enough or far enough. We also consider our work in a wider context, as has been highlighted, potential harms being caused to children by advertising. And we've recently published an opinion that considers how age assurance mechanisms can cut through that potential tension between collecting extra private data to get to the answer, but also ensuring that children are protected from adult harmful or otherwise inappropriate content. It's great to be an invited event from the nation from the G7 because some of our international work has worked with them because, believe it or not, there's sometimes tension between regulators, a world in which British citizens can use Canadian services safely and with confidence, and that Canadian citizens can use British services with confidence and trust. We think the world is better if there is a free flow of data with trust. Nobody wants a system where we're all pulling in different directions. We want to coordinate and have a level of coherence on standards, while we absolutely respect that different countries have different laws, cultural attitudes, and behaviors. We want to get to the place where we have a smooth service that works for everyone, powered by advertising, but in a way that doesn't harm people's privacy. We've got a way to go. A recent survey we did, we saw 60% of UK customers agree or strongly agree with the statement. I find it intrusive when I get advertising that's been targeted specifically to me because of things I've searched for or done online in the past. And I think I would expect from conversations I've had that may be a similar feeling. We've got to get past that feeling. We need to alleviate that tension of intrusion by not stretching trust. Trust will allow us all to enjoy ad-funded services without that tension headache. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really interesting. and great to hear your perspective. So before I turn to questions, I know we've got a lot that's been said here, so I want to sort of open the floor if anyone has anything that this has sparked or anything. I thought so.
Yeah, no, but just very, very briefly, I really appreciated that, those notes. And I think that it's really important to reiterate again, look, we're doing the best that we can with the current state of what we have. And while we recognize, honestly, we didn't invent cookie banners. We didn't invent them. We were actually forced into a place where we had to have something. There's no alternative. When you have a piece of regulation that says you need to notify somebody before or at the time of processing, there is no technical solution other than a cookie banner today, I stress, other than that. And so, yes, it's not ideal, but it is what we have. And at a very minimum, I think what the industry is doing is we're trying to ensure that at least that works, right? So we're trying to do everything that we can to keep the industry in check, to keep it in compliance with the tools that we have today, with the view that this will become outdated and there will be new technologies that address things in a more holistic and a natural way. That's the point I just wanted to make there.
So can I just jump in? I think, Sonia, I understand your perspective. I heavily disagree with it. And I think I would like to have a conversation that's not at the level ad blockers or theft, because people's perceptions are different. And, when we talk about livelihoods, there are other things and other technologies that are impacting people's livelihoods. Ads are impacting the election results and like literal lives of people in other countries. So I think we have to be really careful, again, not to put it purely on a commercial level, where if you block ads, people are losing jobs, because we're past that stage. It is still largely commercial, but it's not. And the fact that, blockchain will solve everything, I'm really sorry, but I'm very, very skeptical. And I think at this point, we need to do better. Everybody needs to do better. And I'm highly skeptical of the consent model that, the users are going to agree, they're going to click on I agree, and, I'll be totally fine with being followed and stuff. My own work in user literacy says that even if people understood what they're consenting on, they have no choice, right? Like, and that's the problem in terms of a binary model. You either choose with the conditions that it comes with, or you don't get access to the service. And behavioral economics has taught us that, even if people understood, they make irrational choices. And I think at this point, people cannot not monetize, cannot even conceptualize the types of harm that can come from these kinds of trackings. And so I think we need to do better with the technologies that are today, and not just say like, blockchain is going to solve this in like 5 or 10 years time, because there are underlying concerns with those technologies too, including lack of transparency, that, it may be feasible to fix it on the technological level, but it's not going to be feasible to actually know, who has access to the data and who's actually manipulating the code. So I think we're all on the same page that ads are here to stay, but I don't think we're on the same page in terms of the volume and the scope of intrusion that the ads have into people's lives.
Well, I'd love to hear the solutions that you have in mind to fix the current state, right? So it sounds to me that you have something in mind that we could build in the current state.
Well, stop monetizing on users' data. Like, part of the thing is like all that's done is done for profit. Right. So like the benevolence is, yes, it creates job, but it creates jobs for very few. I don't have specific solutions, and don't tell me, it's an academic exercise and, ivory tower can think about whatever. But I think there is considerable tension in terms of not just the volume of data that's being collected, but like what is being done with that data. And I think people have considerable concerns that they have become goods, right? And people are not comfortable being goods for the profit of very selected few.
And I think as well as those sort of probably big philosophical discussions we need to get on, but practically there are things you can do now to be compliant. I think, you know, I touched on it, the contextual advertising, where if I go to a page about a topic, we talked earlier about canning tomatoes, showing me ads on that for other ways to preserve fruit and veg are likely to be highly relevant, but don't need to know anything about me or who I am and what I'm doing. So we believe there are ways you can do it now. I do think there are closer technologies than blockchain enabled mechanisms that can give us benefit. Now, one of the things we're very interested in and actually took to the G7 to discuss, because we think this needs to be a global initiative, is this idea, I think as Marina highlighted, that you're trying to achieve something pops up in the way. That's a terrible experience for everyone. That's terrible for businesses because you can't actually rely on it being genuine consent and trust from the people. It's terrible for users because they're just trying to they're trying to buy the thing they want. They're trying to enjoy their content. They don't mind getting it, but they're still having to say yes every time. Or if they do want to, they say no, or as we found before we started making our changes, to have no as an option. They got more info, 30 things, doing everything. You know, it's a huge waste of human time and effort. And the one thing machines are brilliant at are talking very quickly to each other. So our kind of model for how this can be improved before we get to futuristic technologies that may or may not occur is that if users can express their enjoying preferences, and some of the preferences may be, yeah, I'm very comfortable, share my data widely, I'm delighted by the process I get, then that yes should be listened to. They shouldn't even have to say yes every time. But that model, we need that not just because it puts the joy back into browsing the internet and receiving ads that are either tailored and relevant or ads that aren't. We still expect there to be ads. You're not opting out of getting ads, you're opting out of using your data to profile and provide more detailed ads, or your data being sold on for other purposes. That's the control that people get. But fairly soon, a lot of the services we consume are not going to be through a laptop or our mobile device. It's going to be our fridge talking to the hydro company to make sure we get the right pricing in the middle of the night. That's going to be our personal data being shared. I don't want to be woken in the middle of the night to go down my fridge and click accept on a button, or when I'm driving in my car and it's connecting to the next charging station, or a pop up in the middle of the 401, press this button, do this. That's all going to end badly. So we believe that expressing enduring decisions that then are expressed in the moment can provide a real benefit, and we're not too far away from being able to do that. So I do think there are ways we can do it, and even within the current mechanisms, we absolutely see there are some players who are deliberately creating dark kind of word hostile choice architecture to force people into decisions they don't actually want to have. And that kind of behavior, when we see that, we're going to take action, because whatever the circumstances is, we can definitely see a spread of behaviors, and at those who have the largest, highest impact and aren't taking this seriously and are actively trying to manipulate people, that's where we definitely see data being misused, and there's no way you can claim it's that consent. Fascinating, in one study I saw, I think, when they moved to the better choice architecture, they actually found more users accepted, because they felt, actually, this is a site that's respecting my choice. I'm willing to trust them and engage more broadly. So I do think there are things we can do now, as well as solving the bigger kind of what do we do as a society? How do we power innovation and growth? But
Yeah,
that's my kind of sense.
Sure. I don't think my intention was to say, oh, let's wait for blockchain, although what blockchain is here. So that's not futuristic, and it's not sort of like, you know, a Jetson story. But what I did want to make clear is that we are in the process of you know, the grand cleanup. In, you know, about 80% of the creepy factor and the reason why we're doing all these pop-ups is because of third-party cookies. And those third-party cookies are going away in 2023. And if that's not soon enough, I mean, that's pretty fast. That means that the entire ecosystem is working around contextual advertising models, is working around different addressability models that are going to be privacy first. And there's a whole new Lumascape popping up that is all about privacy technologies, privacy efficiencies, and all that sort of stuff. So it's not like the industry is sitting on its laurels and saying, okay, well, we're just going to wait. That's not true. I think it's you know, the stages were this. One is we have third-party cookies, therefore we need a consent transparency mechanism. So we built that because that was an immediate need. That's not to say that that is the Band-Aid solution and that, oh yeah, this is our answer to advertising. No, but the answer is certainly not ad blocking. And you know, again, I just think that if you're blocking ads, you're blocking revenue, and you're blocking, and is it responsible for the jobs? Maybe not 100%, but it's responsible for the content. The newspapers, television, all of the non-digital media has made their money and paid their journalists from advertising. It's not a new model. It's like it's not new for the internet. But in any case, cookies are going away. So technology is forcing the internet to move away from this kind of a creepiness anyways. So I think, you know, Steve and I agree with you. This contextual signaling is becoming the new norm again, and we welcome that.
Okay, so I'd like to step in, and I think there is a fundamental difference between an ad in the newspaper and an ad on television and an ad on the internet. So the ad in the newspaper is not following me around my house, right? And I can choose to flip the page and not read it and not engage. The ad on the internet is following me around and collecting my data, largely without me knowing actually what data are being collected. And so I think, Sonia, I think those are like I think those are false sort of comparators. And it's just like the volume and the intrusion of the ads on the internet is very different. And you know, like if ad blocking is theft, we can have a completely different conversation. And I think we really need to move away from that conversation that it's theft, because who am I stealing from when actually somebody's collecting my data and making money on it and I'm getting nothing out of it, right? So, and I think the whole notion of, you know, link tax and like, you know, ad supporting journalism is like a completely different area. And, you know, we have a bill on that right now, and which is hotly debated. So I think we don't have time for that. But I think we have to make a fundamental distinction between different media and the way the ads work in them. And I think that's the problem, that like they're so intrusive that people just don't trust ads anymore. And like the industry, you know, maybe doing things now, but like has not done things in the past. And there's you're not building trust from zero up, you're building it like from minus something to build it to zero. And so I think that's the piece that the industry has to be working on. And maybe blockchain will solve everything. I don't know if it will, but the lack of trust is why the users choose these mechanisms to protect themselves. Like, you know, and we're past the age where, you know, I have secrets and therefore I want to protect my privacy. I just don't want to know, you know, I don't want my fridge or my washing machine or whatever to know what type of stuff I'm washing, right? Like, or like, you know, what food gets spoiled in my fridge, and maybe I'll get a better sense of, you know, using my budget better because, you know, I'll buy less food and whatever. Like we're not really talking about that. We're talking about the fact that like the industry is monetizing humans without their control and without any ability of us to actually choose what we want to give somebody else to monetize.
I'm adoring being on a panel where the regulator is not at one extreme. This is very good. This is a fresh new experience for me. I had two quick thoughts, and then I think Sonia wants to come back on to those points. The first one, if you think the telly isn't tracking you, get ready for smart TVs, video on demand. There's a whole set of other elements there, but we won't. I don't mean to add to your level of tension, given we're trying to work past that, but just be aware we're seeing one of our concerns about this kind of online tracking ecosystem is as we move move to a more connected devices and a quantified self, we are seeing that stepping in. I do think there are enormous benefits of things like our fridge and washing machine, learning what is in it. But I think it's vital that users have a sense of control over that, so their privacy is respected, so they trust and are willing to share that detail, so they get better experience, can have better environmental impact, all good stuff. But the point I wanted to draw out, just answering Sonia's point, I let Marina go first, is I think the link's been included in the chat. We've done some work because we absolutely understand many businesses want to do the right thing. And one of the problems of a large, complicated global ecosystem is not always clear what that is. So what we've done is published our expectations for online advertising proposals and sort of highlighted, because there's a rich set of possible ways to move forward in a post-cookie world. Some of them, I think, are brilliant from a privacy perspective. Some are marginal improvements that probably don't go far enough. Some actually make things quite a lot worse, because at least with a cookie-based system, the user has some level of control and awareness of what's happening, even if, as we get to server-to-server communications, things like that, some of this tracking and profiling can occur without the users even being aware. And some of our largest enforcements in the last few years have been on some of that sort of wider data broking, where information is collected for one purpose, collected, added to other data to produce a much deeper insight use, far worse than the things we're talking about around trying to make ads more relevant, but actually being profiled and analyzed and used against without even no transparency at all, and often in ways that harm the individual, where I think at its best, advertising is entertaining, it introduces us to new products, it gives us value, and it funds and supports the things we get. So I think there are, perhaps this can diffuse the tension, because there are things even worse than the ad ecosystem, and we should get those as well. Yeah, I think it's not our position as regulators to pick winners, but if we set common standards and say you've got to be at least this good to thrive, and if you do that, we're not going to bother you, we hope that allows the innovation and thought to have these things kind of grow. Because you're exactly right, there's a lot of really interesting work going on in this space right now, trialing and developing things, because there is this great understanding from all the players, I think, in the ecosystem, that things have to change. And whether or not it's theft, there's clearly a signal that if your key customers are spending time and money to avoid your service, something has gone wrong in that relationship. And we need to make sure that the level of trust doesn't decay to the point where many, many people are not engaging and using these services, because it will be an end to funding some of the critical and valuable things we have, as perhaps we've seen in traditional media, as some of the products and services we loved as children have disappeared because there isn't a model to support them in the modern world. We want to make sure that kind of innovation is kept.
Yeah, agree. I mean, I was comparing advertising in print and TV and the historical, the hundreds of years of advertising. I only raised it to highlight the business model of it, right? So it's about how the content is funded. It's not that it's different in online advertising. Of course, it's different in online advertising. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an association that actually specifically deals with only that and the data that's used. And I think the GDPR actually went a long way to start shining a light on that, and to shining a light on the different purposes, and being a little bit more clear and specific and transparent with the consumers. And as we start moving towards the different types of advertising that are non-cookie based, you're going to see that there's going to be an improvement anyways, because that is what enabled all of that collection and aggregation and sort of profile creation in the first place. And once that is gone, and that is a tech delivered thing, that's not a regulated thing, that's something that tech is just eventually evolving into, you're going to get more and more things like Apple's IFDA saying, hey, are you going to allow this app to track you, yes or no? And it's simple, and you get it right away. As a consumer, you know what your choices are, and it's been devastating to the ad industry, and that's fine. Right? Because we recognize that is what the consumer choice is. And honestly, there, as I mentioned, and I think it was 1996, David Weinberger wrote an amazing, he's a Harvard professor, wrote a book that was basically 20 years ahead of its time, that said that consumers were eventually going to take control of how this thing was going to play out. And it's just taken the industry this long, unfortunately, to stop taking advantage of the ability to use data, And that's the sad truth, right? And every time a new product comes online, like, you know, remember the early days of email, before there was Castle, before there was an anti-spam legislation, and how absolutely ridiculous it was, what your inbox looked like, right? So regulation has certainly played an important role in improving the user experience, in that it does step in and actually, you know, create the guardrails. And we welcome those. Again, this is not about arguing about the fact that the internet isn't a complete gong show when it comes to user experience, and that it isn't self-created. But at the same time, we think that the important moves that are being made, like the elimination of third-party cookies, is really a lot more substantial than what people are giving it credit for. Right? I think that it is a monumental move for the industry, and I'm not sure that you know, people on the outside of the industry who aren't living and breathing this really understand what that meant, or what it means to the industry in terms of the loss of opportunities to be able to follow you around with that pair of shoes that you just aren't buying, or the car that you once showed interest for, that you may or may not want to buy. That goes away. Third-party cookies gone, that means that goes away. We can't track anymore. It's just, you go to a publisher website, and whatever you do with that publisher, namely, you know, add your language preferences, you know, whatever it is, what your experience is on that one website, first-party data that's collected fully transparently, that's what we're left with. And so I think that we've got, like, we know we've got the message. We don't, you know, we're not pretending that we don't understand that change isn't required.
Go ahead, Marina.
So Sonia, I think I'd like to pick on something that you said, which I find really interesting, that you said, you know, when Castle came in, you know, things changed, and every time regulation comes in, we change and we comply. And what I would like to see from the industry, because you're much more agile than the regulators are, is to actually say, okay, we know the new technology is coming in, and we're proactively gonna behave and structure our behavior in a way that we don't even need regulation, right? And so, because every time there is, like, regulatory intervention always lags behind the technology, and, like, by the time we regulate it, it's kind of obsolete already. Like, that's just a truism. And so I think with 20 or 30 years, or how many years of the internet experience, your industry is actually in a position to provide the lead and say, okay, yeah, you said we got the message, but I think the public needs to see not only that you got the message, that you actually have the ability to do it better in every next iteration, because the messages have been learned. Like, you don't have to wait for regulation. And I think that that's their lack of trust, and that's what you have to build, because the trust has been abused. People have a really hard time trusting that, like, whatever models you come up now are actually going to address some of those concerns.
Agreed. But if you don't notice a difference on your Apple iPhone, and that you're getting asked whether or not you want to be tracked, I mean, I'm not sure how much clearer, how much more of a lead, you know, it's no secret that technology that is privacy protecting has become a competitive advantage in the industry right now. Right? It's why Apple is racing towards privacy profiles. It's why everybody is now putting ads on the internet and on television, right? Google is all about security and about protecting your personal profile. I mean, it has literally, privacy has become a competitive advantage for the publishers and for the vendors right now, right? So again, yes, agree. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with the fact that we want to show leadership, and you know, are we at a deficit? Okay, sure. I'm not going to argue that. I tend to like to think about moving forward, right? As you know, as being in technology and having been in this industry for over 25 years, I believe in moving forward, right? So we're doing what we can.
Rena, I think you raised a really interesting point, and this has been sort of a thread throughout the conference today, is that of consumer trust. And so we've talked a lot about the need for organizations to be transparent, but consumers are notoriously bad at actually reading information that's been presented to them. You get cookie banner blindness. I've been guilty of this, downloading an app that I want to use right away. So like, I don't care what any of the documents say, I'm agreeing to whatever, partially because I know I can't negotiate it anyways. And then part of me professionally is like, I'll come back and read this later. Don't often do that. But and we saw Stephen mentioned smart TVs. Like a couple years ago when smart TVs came out, there were headlines all over the place that like, don't talk in the living room, the TV's listening to you. And like, that was the point of the TV. What were people expecting? And Sonia, like you mentioned with Apple, once you were given an explicit choice to opt out of the third-party tracking, tons of people took that and ended up being devastating to the ad industry, like you said. But people may have reacted on the basis that that sounds intrusive. They didn't really know what it meant. They didn't really know what the tracking was happening. So how, if consumers don't necessarily want to take the time to understand, if they're not reading what you're presenting, but lawyers spend hours and hours drafting, then how do you build consumer trust?
I think the critical point I would convey about that is that when trillion-dollar organizations want you to understand something and not be confused about it, they seem perfectly able to do that in really interesting and innovative ways. When they'd prefer you remained somewhat confused and unclear, particularly if that guides you in a particular conclusion that helps them but harms you, not in terms of some evil conspiracy, but just they're optimizing for the values that they're being measured on. It's important to them, and that's why we see when a third party unrelated to the topic writes those interfaces, we get very different answers. Now, as with our working competition, we need to make sure that authority is not using its power to drive those answers in a particular way to disadvantage competitors and push its own model. There definitely is not. We need to make sure there's a level playing field at every level here. But I think the concept that it's the user's fault for not engaging or understanding, I find that hard to believe. And I would just call out to our lawyers and people here, there are many skills that lawyers have. I have many I've worked with over many years and really appreciate their skills and capability. Part of their capability is constructing precisely worded, what an outsider might call jargon, but for those close to it, these nuances have real meaning that is absolutely essential in contracts. But if you have someone who is brilliant at writing contracts, writing your privacy notice, it will be a terrible privacy notice for anyone other than another lawyer. And although lawyers are a fascinating market segment and definitely are valuable on all the services I've been on, I'm not convinced it's big enough to make it that way. So I think if you are a lawyer tasked with writing a privacy notice to getting people to understand this, get somebody else involved. And I would point to, we've seen this is particularly acute when working with children and children's privacy, is that the notices written in legalese, most adults have no hope. Most 5-year-olds have found it very difficult. What we've created, which people are interested, reach out to me and I'll show you the details. We did a transparency champion. So we found organizations, I think one of them might even be Canadian, but we found global organizations who'd found fantastic ways of engaging children, explaining to them in the right way at the right point of time to give them authority and control over what they were doing with their data. And there are fantastic examples in there. So I know this is possible. And I just think it is fascinating that when we observe this, oh yes, no, it is my fault that I'm not engaging with this legal-ish document presented to me. I'm sorry. If the organizations cared, and what's fascinating, I think many of them do. If we do this well, we get such a brand loyalty, such an engagement, you're much more likely to click on ads if you're like, oh, I trust this site and it's serving me this guy. You get better click through, you get better users. I think we haven't touched on it today. The other problem with this ecosystem, not only ads, is the massive levels of fraud, where poor advertisers and poor publishers, there's other players in the ecosystem just siphoning money out of this infrastructure. So I think it's about 30%, as PwC study talks about 30% of the funding in advertising is disappears somewhere else into it, not through the legitimate players. So if you want to really to link back to that theft statement, that's where we should be looking, because that kind of abuse is harming every player in this ecosystem. But that's thankfully a little bit beyond the privacy regulators. But Sonia.
Yeah, we've built a lot of things to actually help with that, to help, and not to call it blockchain, but it is a blockchain premise, right? There's handshake technology now that we've implemented that allows vendors only to sell to known entities, which has removed a lot of that siphoning of the impressions from the internet. I think that building trust is just to answer the panel question. I agree with everything that you say, Stephen. I would also add that we have to get away from placebo, and we have to become a little bit more, rapid in terms of showing that trust, right? So you make a change to your settings, and the consumer deserves to see immediate effect. And that when I hit this toggle and I turn something off, it has in fact turned off. It is not some sort of a straggling, oh, there were exceptions, or there was fine print here, or something like that. So, and I think that that's the next thing to tackle. And as you can imagine, when there's hundreds of thousands of players and websites and ad tech in the industry, it's very difficult to communicate and to make sure that everybody gets the same memo that says, when this toggle is turned off, it means, no means no, okay, ad tech. So I think that's kind of a really important challenge for us on the technical side, is to make sure that things aren't just, vaporware, and that they're actually, not placebo.
Okay. Well, as much as I would love to continue this discussion, the next panel does need to start. So I'm very grateful to all three of you for joining us today and sharing your fantastic insights. I will now pass it on to Chantal Bernier, who is counsel and co-chair of the Global Privacy and Cybersecurity Group at Dentons. And Chantal's panel will be discussing the topic on regulating our online harm and avoiding surveillance.